In this part of the presentation, we're now going to look at types of management methods that we can use on the farm to control our pests. So approaches for pest management are often grouped into the following categories and are illustrated in this kind of triangle here. And so when we use IPM strategies, we always start at the base of the triangle with prevention, something called cultural care, and then we work our way up. And as we saw in the previous slides, we're only going to take on these sorts of methods if the action threshold has been reached, which is something that we have decided, this threshold that we've decided based on our monitoring and the data that we've been collecting on those pests on the farm. In IPM, we always begin with this prevention technique, and we try to do things on the farm that are going to keep pests from becoming an issue through cultural controls and something called sanitation. And then if these techniques don't work, we then step in to try other methods like physical and mechanical controls, as well as something called a biological control. And then as part of IPM, we may need to consider chemical pesticides, but only as a final resort. So in this process, we are choosing essentially the least harmful path of action. And we're going to be using methods, different types of methods in combination in order to provide longer term, the most effective management strategy rather than just the quick fix to the situation. Okay, so if we, again, start at the base of that triangle with cultural controls and prevention techniques, and we work our way up, we're now going to take a look at some specific examples of methods that fall under each of these types of categories. So starting with the bottom, prevention, cultural control. So in these methods, it means that we're doing things around the farm and on the farm or to our plants to modify the environment that those crop plants are growing in order to reduce the presence of unwanted organisms. So this means that pests are still going to exist on the farm, but the impact of them is going to be avoided through these practices to help reduce the pest's ability to establish in the environment or to reproduce or to disperse or move around and survive. Okay, so this type of control also means basically setting up our crops to be healthy and successful in order for them to adequately defend themselves as well from these pests, these organisms. Okay, so we're setting up our plants to be successful. And cultural controls or prevention or cultural care, these all mean the same thing. They could just take lots of different forms, as you can see on the slide here. They can be things that you do even before you plant, during the design phase of your farm. For example, when you initially assess your site and lay out your beds, you can group your plants according to their growth needs, their nutrient demands, how you're going to care for them or water them. Cultural controls also include the type of plants that you decide to grow, like choosing locally adapted varieties that are hardy for our area, or varieties of crops that are known to be resilient, resistant to certain pests or certain diseases, for example. Soil preparation, proper planting techniques, all of that also falls under this category of cultural control or preventative prevention in IPM. For example, choosing the right tillage practices to match your soil, giving your plants adequate space and water and nutrients so that they can develop properly. Anything we do to avoid stressing our plants out, making them more vulnerable to pests and diseases. That falls under this category. Sanitation, this shows up in that triangle, that figure that we just saw. Sanitation is a very important practice on the farm that prevents pest introductions and can also prevent you from spreading pests and diseases around. And sanitation can mean everything from starting with disease-free seeds, so buying seeds from a reputable seed source that has gone and tested for, say, seed-borne viruses and diseases, or even making sure, that you clean your tools after every use to avoid transferring things like soil-borne fungi, bacterial diseases, even nematodes from one bed to another. So that's kind of what we mean by sanitation. Up on the right-hand side here, we're looking at, crop maintenance, doing things to set your plants up to be successful, like watering them, matching their needs with your irrigation schedules, fertilizing, amending the soil, and then even things that you do, during the planting phases. All of that crop planting you do is considered a cultural practice. You can plan to grow a diversity of plants on the farm, switching up host plants frequently in your crop rotation to avoid pests from building up in the soil, including cover crops in there. In your rotation is also considered a cultural practice, and can also, not only help attract beneficial organisms to keep your pests in check, but can also prevent weeds from sprouting up, things like that. And then even doing things like modifying your planting dates and your harvest dates. So making adjustments to pest life cycles and avoiding times in the season when pests are going to be very active. Those are all practices that fall under this first category. So if you try cultural controls, you're using prevention and say that doesn't necessarily work a whole lot, there are now other things that we can start to incorporate into our IPM program to start to take steps to managing the pest more, more directly. And so these are going to be things that start to get into this mechanical physical control scenario. And these are going to be mechanisms that are going to kill a pest directly, but they can also be things that block a pest out from a bed or from around your plants, or they might also fall under a category called physical controls that try to manipulate the environment or change the environment to make it unsuitable for the pest to live there. So honestly, I kind of group mechanical and physical controls together, just lump them all together into the same thing. You might see some IPM texts that like to separate them out. And I try to do that as best as I can in this lecture, but know that they do kind of fall in the same, in sort of like that same stage as you're kind of going through the different controls in IPM. Mechanical, if you were to go through like the definitions, mechanical is technically labor, machinery, and tools to reduce numbers of pests. And then physical controls are those that alter the environment to reduce pest numbers. So that's the small details. So mechanical controls, let's look at some examples and maybe it'll be a little bit clearer. So mechanical controls, again, we're doing things to remove the insects or kill them or trap them. This could be as easy as like hand picking. So removing insects, removing eggs by hand, or pruning or pinching off diseased plant parts to suppress the spread of a plant disease or pathogen. Forceful spray of water is really effective and can help like dislodge insects, especially aphids, from the undersides of foliage. It's a very effective pest control measure. Trapping, attractants, pheromone traps like this tent trap here, even yellow sticky cards are not only used for monitoring, but they can also be used to trap insects, lower the damage that they're going to do to your crops. So yeah, so a couple other examples like mulching, tilling, even vacuuming, all of these can help suppress pest numbers and be considered a mechanical control. Barriers are a big mechanical control that we do practice a lot on campus. We set up barriers around our plants with screens like this guy on the bottom right. So we have insect netting, we use screens. Many farms, including the farm I work at downtown, also has floating row cover. It's this agrabah. It's like a woven fabric that we use. We just cover our beds, even like right after we've sown into the beds and we've, planted seeds. We put seedlings in there. We just cover the whole entire row with agrabah. And it also helps the plants, the seedlings, sort of acclimate to that harsh environment out in the bed where there's more wind and more extreme sunlight. We're just protecting that garden bed. So barriers can be kind of big, cover the whole row or the whole bed, but they can also be smaller, like on an individual plant scale. This is just a little, it almost looks like a toilet paper roll around a tomato plant. Basically, you would put that in if you have cutworms, which are these little caterpillars that like to hang around the soil, and they'll just like nibble right through the stem of your plants. So you can put a little collar, a little barrier around the stem of your plant to protect it from cutworm damage. So those are some options of more mechanical controls. Physical controls, slight difference here is that we're now trying to change the environment, the abiotic conditions, to then kill or suppress or deter the pest. So some examples here include soil solarization. This is very common to kill or suppress numbers of like insect larvae or nematodes. Sometimes it's used for some pathogenic bacteria and soil dwelling fungi, things like that. Essentially what you do is you till the soil, you flatten it out, you add water, and then you put this plastic sheet mulching down. You tightly wrap your bed. And usually you do this during the hottest time of the year. So then the soil heats up really hot and it kills off all of the harmful pests, or at least suppresses the numbers to a point where you can manage them through other cultural practices. Obvious downsides to using that sort of suppression method, because you're not only, harming the bad guys, but you're also harming a lot of the beneficial organisms in the soil as well. But there is that option. If you have a really bad nematode problem, that might be something that you could use to to get the numbers low enough to at least manage them. Another option, kind of a neat one shown on this slide here, is the picture in the middle here in this little figure. This is called reflective mulch. It's another type of like plastic sheeting, but it reflects UV light. And it pretty much like confuses a lot of these insects that you see here, like thrips and aphids and whiteflies. And so it confuses them to the point where they don't even really see the plant. They kind of just like fly right off. So there's that option. So it's changing the abiotic conditions, the light, and solarization, you're changing the temperature, and then that's affecting the pest numbers. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies those small differences between like a mechanical control and a physical control. All right, now into some of the more interesting pest control strategies. So this is a type of strategy that has actually gained a lot of popularity in sustainable agriculture. This is the use of biological controls. So in this type of pest control, we're now relying on the activities of natural enemies or natural predators of our pest organisms to keep our pest populations in check. So in other words, we're using the activity of one organism to reduce the adverse effects of another. And these natural enemies are going to do this by having like negative effects on the growth of the pest, their survival, their dispersal, and their ability to reproduce. Okay, so there are a few different types of organisms that we qualify as natural enemies. We have predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. We'll see some examples on the next slide. And then also in the next few slides, you're going to see there are a couple different ways that we can handle biological control, either through something called conservation biocontrol, or classical or importation biological control, and then augmentation is another type. Okay, so 3 different types of organisms and 3 different types of biocontrol that we'll see some slides on. All right, so here are some examples of some of the common organisms that are going to help control pests on the farm. So we have parasitoids. These guys include many types of insects. Mostly they're tiny little wasps or tiny little flies. And like this wasp here, they are natural enemies and will parasitize many different types of pests. A lot of caterpillars are parasitized by these. The little wasp or the little fly will come in and will lay an egg either inside the caterpillar, its host, or it will lay an egg on the outside of its host. And then as the egg starts to develop and the the larvae of this little wasp here begins to grow, it uses up the resources of that caterpillar host, and it eventually kills it. So in sort of like an alien style situation, that little new parasitoid wasp is going to come and emerge out of that caterpillar's body. It's pretty gnarly. So yeah, parasitoids, really good natural enemies, usually only parasitize like 1 or 2 to a handful of insect pests in their lifetime. But if you bring in the right habitat and the right other plants and other resources for these guys, you can attract a number of them to the farm and they can help you out a lot. Predators are another type of biocontrol, and these are going to include a pretty diverse group of organisms like hoverfly. The larvae of hoverfly will eat lots of soft-bodied insects, lots of aphids and mites and thrips and things like that. Lady beetles do the same. They're voracious predators, even though they're super cute. They love to snack on aphids. Nematodes in the soil can also have predatory properties. Mites can also be predatory mites and eat, the bad mites on your farm, as well as lacewing. Lacewing larvae are really good natural predators. And then lastly, we have a group of microorganisms that are pathogens. You might not always think of like a pathogen like a fungus or even a virus or a bacteria being considered a biological control organism, but many of these are living things and can keep pest populations in check pretty successfully. BT being a really big one. Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacteria. It's also actually used as a microbial pesticide on many organic farms. So you could buy BT and you can treat your plants with it, and the bacteria will actually they naturally produce this toxin, this protein that basically is very toxic to many caterpillar species. So it can be used as a biological control for caterpillars. Fungi, another good example. That's what this picture is showing here, Beauveria bassiana. It's a fungus, natural fungus that secretes products that help control tons of different types of insects, including caterpillars, ants, mealybugs, thrips, even whiteflies. So that's more of a call that a broad spectrum control. So it controls lots of different species of pests. So now that we kind of introduced the organisms that can help manage our pest populations, we can look at how we approach biological control. And we can do this in a couple different ways. Conservation biological control means that we're going to provide habitat and alternative food sources to promote the local biodiversity, and we're going to try to attract native predatory insects or natural enemies of pests to our farm. Okay, so we can do this by planting borders of mixed native plants. We can put borders of seasonal or annual flower producing plants, anything that's going to help attract these natural enemies of pests. Another term for this whole process is creating hedgerows. Or companion planting is also a form of conservation biological control. And it's kind of a cute way to remember what conservation biological control is doing, in that it's providing SNAP, which stands for shelter, nectar, alternative prey, and pollen. Because many of these natural enemies not only rely on whatever the pest is that you're trying to control, but they have alternate prey that you also need to create habitat for. They themselves need habitat and shelter, and then they also do feed on things like nectar and pollen as resources. Okay, so that's conservation biological control. Oh, I also put on this slide that they do also act in some cases as something called the trap crop. So trapping crops for common pests, putting in mixed flower plantings or native plants can actually help lure pests away from your main crop, your main garden beds. as well as provide, the resources, these SNAP resources to your natural enemies. So they might have dual functions as well. So it's really good to have that diversity growing on the farm. All right, another form of biocontrol usually deals with trying to manage a pest that is an exotic pest, so an organism that's been introduced from outside of our region. This is called classical biocontrol or importation. And this kind of goes back to, thinking about why pests are so successful. So one of the reasons why many organisms are just so good at being pests is that they have been maybe accidentally introduced to our area, to an area that they can survive with. They have the food, the habitat, all the resources to reproduce, and they can do this without their native predators around. Okay, so this actually happens a lot, especially in our Mediterranean climate. There are many insects in Southern California, many weeds, as we'll see in the semester, that, tons of weed species around California that are invasives. They've been introduced by accident from other areas of the world that have similar climates to us. So they do really well, they establish quickly, they make a ton of seeds, and they don't have any predators to eat them. So that's how that happens. In the insect world, there are a couple historical examples of importation biological control being successful. This is just one example I thought I'd bring up. It's an example from the California citrus industry. So this is a pest called a scale insect that was introduced from Australia, likely came to the United States just from being on probably some ornamental trees, some plants that we brought over and wanted to plant, and then it escaped and took over and did a number on our citrus industry. The industry suffered some pretty big economic losses within a fairly short amount of time. So that's what this little tiny fuzzy scale insect has done. But to handle this, folks who were studying the system, entomologists, they went back to Australia to figure out, okay, what are the predators that naturally control this scale insect? Because this isn't a big issue in Australia, so there's got to be something there that's keeping it in check normally. So they found this guy, the Rhodalia beetle, is the native predator, and they introduced that exotic organism to California. Now I'm obviously simplifying like the whole process. They obviously put these together in laboratory situations and field situations, and they tried to see, all of the possible effects that this guy introducing a Rhodalia beetle to the United States could have. So there's lots of studies and research that goes into this sort of process before just like going and introducing another exotic organism. But kind of fast forwarding through that process. Today, both of these species exist still in California, but they exist at very low levels. So they don't have any effect now on citrus production. They just fluctuate consistently at low levels. Okay. So that's one success story. There's a couple other ones out there, but this process, this is a very long process that, lots of research and evidence has to go into it before they end up actually importing another organism to control an invasive one. But there is another type of biological control that's kind of similar to that importation method, and this is called augmentation. And this is a type of biocontrol where we would periodically release a native natural enemy or native predator, or even a microbe that's native to, say, California, to keep a pest population low. Okay, and so this is something that you can do if you're a home gardener. You can probably go and buy natural enemies that normally exist in California. There's hundreds of different types that are commercially available. This little trichogramma wasp is one example, but there's you can go to a local nursery and there's lady beetles that you can buy, or lacewings, etc. In terms of the effectiveness of augmentation, it's honestly not always the most effective. A lot of the times, if you take a batch of lady beetles and you release them into your garden, you'll probably notice over time, like 90% of them or 95% will just fly away. They don't stick around. But there have been studies that look at the effectiveness of the handful of predators that do stay in your garden, and they are actually very effective. So you have to introduce a lot to get the small number to stay there to actually do the work and help you out. So this is an option that is available to a lot of people. All right, so yeah, biological control. We saw some different organisms. We see the different ways that people can handle it. But I guess take-home message-wise, relying on organisms as biocontrol agents is probably way more complex than a lot of people realize. And it really involves kind of taking a look at the whole food chain and all the possible interactions of the organisms on your farm, because lots of different unintended interactions can happen. And we will actually see some examples when we now look at the very last type of control, which is the chemical control. So when we practice IPM, obviously we're going to try to rely on all of these controls that we've just talked about so far to manage our pests, but sometimes this isn't always possible, and we may need to rely on a pesticide to help either kill or prevent or repel our pests, keep them from damaging our plants. So in IPM doesn't necessarily mean chemical free, nor does the term organic. Surprisingly, there are actually a number of different products and materials that are allowed under USDA organic standards. They just have to be on the OMRI list, the Organic Materials Research Institute list, which is the institute that maintains the whole list of pesticides and other approved things that you can be using under that umbrella of certified organic. But yeah, just because a pesticide is approved for organic use does not mean it's always the best choice. It's not good to just go and start spraying away without doing some research into what that pesticide is and how it works and how it persists in our environment. Okay, so if we do decide that you need to go that chemical route for whatever reason, you've reached that action threshold, you've tried a number of other different controls in combination with each other, and it's not, you have evidence to show that it doesn't seem to be working, then we can try pesticides. We always consider it as a last resort, and pesticides are always going to be used in combination with other approaches. And then as a strategy, to folks looking to grow organically, it's always advised to choose pesticides that are what are called selective pesticides. So they don't have like off-target effects on other organisms. Obviously, they're going to be safe to us and to the environment and to beneficial insects and other organisms. And yeah, we want to use these in ways that are going to minimize any kind of harm. Okay. So let's take a look at some examples. There's lots of organically approved pesticides. Many of these are actually derived from plants. So we call these botanical pesticides. And I've listed a couple examples here. And I've sort of ranked them from like the most toxic to the least toxic. So nicotine sulfate, so it's derived from tobacco plants. This is a chemical that's used to control lots of different types of insects, aphids, spider mites, mostly sucking insects, but lots of different species. It's a pretty nasty chemical. I wouldn't advise you to go and start using nicotine sulfate right away. It carries if you look at pesticide label warnings, it carries a danger warning because it can be absorbed very quickly through skin and is pretty toxic to humans as well as other mammals. Okay, but yeah, that is a botanical pesticide that you might see. Sabadilla is another example of botanical pesticide. It's derived from lilies, from the seeds of lilies actually. It carries a warning label, so it's an irritant to our eyes and our skin, can harm other mammals on the farm, but it does control a lot of different caterpillar species, as well as stink bugs, like a lot of the exotic stink bugs that we have in California, squash bugs, as well as thrips and leafhoppers as well. So it's another broad spectrum, kind of hits a lot of different groups of insects. Rotenone is from legumes. It's actually derived from the roots. Takes care of leaf-feeding insects like caterpillars and aphids and beetles. This one carries rotenone carries a caution label, so it's a lot less toxic than like nicotine sulfate, but you have to be careful because if you overuse it, it can kind of go downstream into water sources and it is very harmful to fish. So we do need to watch out when we use that one, if we do need to use that one. Pyrethrin is from chrysanthemum plant, shown here, not to be confused with pyrethroids, which are synthetic pesticides and are very bad. We don't want to be using those. Pyrethrin is a wide spectrum, hits a bunch of different insects, but it has pretty low toxicity. The same thing goes for neem. Neem is it's an oil from the neem tree, sprayed on plants to control leaf-feeding caterpillars, aphids, thrips, mites, as well as many diseases. Okay, so neem is a very common one you see, especially in like nurseries, they sell it. Breaks down pretty quickly in the environment, doesn't stick around. So that's a good option. And then lastly, just wanted to briefly mention some inorganic pesticides that are actually approved for organic production as well. And these are going to be materials that are created from naturally occurring minerals. Many of these products are very useful against pests, many diseases as well. Sulfur, the first one here, actually this is one of the oldest pesticides in the world. It has a pretty broad mode of action. It's effective against scale insects, spider mites, thrips, but you have to be careful not to overuse it because it can actually burn your plants, especially on a hot day. Kaolin clay, that's what's actually shown in this picture here. It's a natural white material that's produced just from weathering of rocks with aluminum silicate. So it's actually just spraying your plants with clay. And it's often used at pretty high rates to protect crops from heat stress. So it's white, so it reflects light and it keeps your plants from getting sunburned. It doesn't do so much in terms of like insect maintenance, but it has a tendency to actually like confuse insects a lot. So they try to land on the plants and they don't understand why the plant is white and bright, kind of like that reflective mulch material. So it does end up having like a repellent effect for many insects just because of the color of it and having that like reflective quality. But it's mostly used like in nursery and crop production for to protect plants against heat stress and prevent sunburning in vegetables and fruit production. Horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps. These are kind of interesting products. They tend to have like a smothering effect on pests. They basically coat the plant material and coat the pests, like this lacewing here, which is actually a natural enemy. So we don't want to be using them a whole lot because they have effects on beneficial organisms. Insecticidal soaps, not the same as like making a dish detergent and spraying your plants with that. You have to be really cautious about any kind of homemade insecticidal soaps and oils. I honestly wouldn't use anything unless you know that recipe's been tested by a university. But there are many commercial products available in both of these categories that are good for keeping like pretty soft-bodied insects in check, like caterpillars, aphids, mites, things like that. But again, they can harm a number of beneficial organisms, so we have to use them sparingly if we're going to use them. All right, so I kind of already mentioned that if we are to use a pesticide on the farm, that it's best to go ahead and try to select the most targeted type. Okay, so what I mean by that is that there are selective pesticides and pesticides that are also considered non-selective. So selective pesticides are those that are going to be toxic to the one organism that you're looking to control. That organism and maybe like its most closely related species or relatives. This is in contrast to non-selective or broad spectrum pesticides that target many different pest species. Okay, now choosing a selective pesticide is going to be the least harmful to non-target organisms. However, there are still negative effects of using it. There is something called pesticide resistance that can happen. The same thing goes for broad spectrum. It not only has the downsides of targeting many different species, including natural enemies, but that can lead to things called pest resurgence, as well as secondary pest outbreaks. Okay, so there are some different outcomes from using both of these types of pesticides that I want to talk about and stress the importance of. So first one is pesticide resistance. This is one of the big things that can happen from overusing a selective pesticide. So a selective pesticide is, again, one that you're targeting a specific species of pest. Okay. So what can happen with pesticide resistance is that the ability of a pest to tolerate that selective pesticide starts to increase. And this figure is going to kind of walk us through how that develops, how that resistance develops. So in the first panel here on the left, you're going to be applying, say you apply a selective pesticide at a high concentration, and you're applying it very frequently to control, these look like stink bugs of some kind. Okay, so we have this group of insects, and whenever we consider a large group of insects, based on their genetics, their inherent variability, and just by chance, by probability, there's going to be likely at least one, maybe more individuals that are resistant to that selective pesticide. So resistance is then going to develop because the application of the pesticide is going to kill all the insects that are susceptible to it. So all these lighter colored stink bugs are susceptible. They're going to die. This little dark colored one is resistant. He can tolerate it. So he's going to go on, and that insect is then, that has the resistant gene, the genetic makeup, that's going to become the genetic basis for the next generation, for the offspring. Okay. So then if the farmer continues to apply a selective pesticide, the pest population will at some point then consist entirely of those darker colored insects. So they're not going to be affected by it anymore. They're going to keep reproducing and keep passing on the resistant gene, whatever that is. Okay, so this process actually happens pretty quick. Insects, by their biology and their nature, most of them have a tendency to reproduce quickly. They produce many generations in a single year with many offspring, which within each of those generations. So this evolution, this human-induced evolution, resistance to a pesticide can come about very fast, surprisingly, within a couple of years, if not even shorter, depending on how frequently and at what concentration you're applying the pesticide. All right, so looking at some other examples of what can happen when using pesticides, this is some stuff that's going to happen when we now apply a broad spectrum chemical. So this is a phenomenon that occurs when we harm both the pest and its natural enemies. Okay, so in this figure here, we're seeing now an example of pest resurgence. So in the first part of the figure, we now have a plant with aphids, which is our pest, the little light colored ones. And these darker insects are lacewing larvae. They're a kind of natural predator of the aphids. And if we spray a broad spectrum pesticide that kills most of the aphids, but it takes care of all of the natural enemy, those remaining aphids are going to go on to reproduce in the absence of the predator. So then we get this situation where the pests, the aphids, reappear and there's like a boom in the population. There's tons more of them because that lacewing larva, those two lacewing larvae here were killed off. And we now have to wait for more to be attracted back to take care of the pest resurgence. Okay, so we've accidentally killed the natural enemy that was already doing a good job at trying to keep those pests in check. And we've created a situation where the pest has a chance to resurge. The population just increases very rapidly. All right, so if you think that's a cruddy situation, here's another thing that can happen when we use a broad spectrum pesticide. So we can get something called a secondary pest outbreak. So in this example, we have another plant where there's two pests, and unfortunately, they both look very similar. We have aphids and spider mites. Okay. And the aphid is the pest that we're trying to control. And the spider mites are there, but they're maybe not a big issue to us. We don't see them as causing any economic damage right now because they're being held in check by these predatory mites. Okay, so we have the two pests, a major pest and a minor pest, and we have natural enemies, the lacewing that's taking care of the aphids, but not so great. So we're going to apply a pesticide for that. And then the mites, which happen to be taking care of the spider mites, but we're not really thinking about the consequences of spraying pesticide. So we apply the broad spectrum pesticide to this plant. We kill the aphids, the spider mites for the most part, and then both of the natural enemies. We're hurting everybody because it's wide spectrum. And because we've accidentally killed the natural enemies, we now have aphids that are reproducing without their predator and spider mites that were not originally an issue, but now they have the capability of thriving without their native enemy. Then they're going to cause secondary pest outbreaks. Okay, so we can see how this happens also graphically. I love a good graph, especially pest management graph. So here's our pest. This is our major pest here in the dark line. We have a secondary pest, like a minor pest that is kind of under the radar. There's a parasite down here that happens to be taking care of that secondary pest. We apply an insecticide that kills everybody. So our original pest can resurge. Our secondary pest can also have another outbreak. Okay, and that's because they're both able to reproduce without its natural parasite, its enemy. All right, so because of these phenomenon, it's always critical to consider all those unintended impacts when using pesticides on the farm. So in addition to thinking about the possible interactive effects among organisms, depending on the selectivity of your pesticides, we also want to look at like the relative toxicities of these chemicals, maybe their mode of action, how they actually work in the organisms, as well as how they persist in the environment. And that's kind of what this slide is getting at. So before using one, I always would make sure to read up on those chemicals, look at the labels, know its associated hazards, understand how exactly to apply it. So you're applying it properly at the right rate, at the right time, and also learn as much as you can about how it moves in the environment. Many of these pesticides can run off in water, they can drift in the air and be incorporated into other parts of the environment and harm many off-target organisms. Many of these are also considered systemic pesticides, where they can move within the various plant parts and they can end up in flowers and harm our pollinators like our native bees. So there's lots of unintended impacts, including human exposure as well, that we do need to read up on and consider before using anything like a chemical pesticide. So I guess as a final take-home message to all of this, I think it's important to think about the possible interactive effects, not only think short-term when it comes to managing pests, but think long-term, really evaluate your system. And for sustainable agriculture, it's important to focus, instead on building up a healthy and diverse ecosystem on the farm, and then doing this, we're going to promote the presence of our natural enemies, and they're going to help limit pest populations. So the more diversity you have on the farm and try to promote on the farm, the less of any one pest you're going to have to deal with. And I think this really hits at the core of a lot of what IPM is trying to get at.